Hello guys, welcome to Python and Machine Learning Daily. If you have a machine learning model built, how to publish it for others to use. So in this video we will go from here, from machine learning model in Jupyter Notebook, publish that as a web page for predicting of the salaries. So this is the input, someone provides years of experience, and then that comes from machine learning model pre-trained. Or you can publish that as API. So here I am in my Postman API client. Again, I provide the parameter of experience like 2.5 years, and we have API endpoint, which under the hood uses our machine learning model. So we will build that from scratch, transforming our Jupyter Notebook into Python script, saving the model into a pickle file, and creating the API and the web page with Python Flask. Let's go step by step. So here's our starting machine learning model, which already works in Jupyter Notebook. So you predict the salary. In our case, it's a linear regression machine learning model. But in this case, it doesn't really matter what model is. The goal of this video is so you would be able to deploy and publish any model that has inputs and outputs. So the input is years of experience of developers, and the output is a predicted salary based on the CSV file that we have here. So imagine you have that model already. Now the next step is to publish it, and the next sub-step is to transform that from a Jupyter Notebook into a proper Python file. So here I am in my PyCharm, already copy and pasted the code from Jupyter Notebook, and we have two things in this Python file. We have to do two things. First, we need to save the model itself. So that would be one Python file, and then another file will be actually using that model. So that second file would do import method from our model and call model.predict with years of experience as a parameter. The next step was the cleanup. So I've cleaned up the Python file by removing the libraries that we didn't need, because in Jupyter Notebook we used matplotlib to evaluate something, also used NumPy. So we need to import only what we actually need for the exportable model, and also I've put all of that on top. In Jupyter Notebook it's pretty common to import something along the way, but this looks much clearer to me. And our goal is to export that model after it's fit and trained. So how do we do that? We add two new lines to our code. Import joblib from Python, and you need to do pip install joblib beforehand, and then joblib dump the model, which is already fit and trained, into so-called pickle file .pkl. And after we execute that, I already did that behind the scenes, we have this pkl file. You don't need to open that, it's not humanly readable actually. What you need to do is import that model in another Python file, or it may be the same file. For now, let's do it the same file. Let's move all of that into a function. So define something like def create model, and then we do all of that with indentation, and then we'll have another function of using that model. Or in fact, let's do it without function for now. We have 3 lines of code, so we load that model with joblib again, and then we can use that model predict with a parameter of 3.5 years, and then we print the result. Let's try it out. We execute, and here's the result. The predicted salary is calculated outside of the function by loading the model. The model is already trained, loaded into a pickle file, so this Python code may be executed elsewhere from another Python file. Now let's transform that into a function, also define predict salary, and we will have a parameter of integer years of experience, like this, and then we do that, and the parameter will be years of experience. In fact, it should not be integer, it's just years of experience, and then we use it here like this, and instead of print, we return the salaries. Return salaries 0. So now we have the main py file, which should be probably renamed to something like model.py, and it has internal function of creating the model, and then kind of outside API for outside files to use that model. So let's rename that file into predict model.py, for example, or salary model, for example, like this. And then we'll have another main.py. So let's create a new Python file, main.py, which would import. So from salary model, import predict salary. And then we'd be able to call that predict salary with, for example, 3.5 as a parameter. That's our goal. Well, it's not the final goal, it's just the next milestone, the step. Also, one more thing, if we just load that function, it may be so that pickle file isn't generated yet. So let's generate that if it doesn't exist, and for that, we add these two lines. So if file doesn't exist, we will create that. For that, we need to add OS library from Python, which should be imported here on top, like this. Now let's try to delete that pickle file, launch our main py with print predict salary, like this, and let's launch the current file. And the result is the same, and the pickle file is generated fresh. Great, it works. The next step is to transform that calling of that method to API or web page. And we will do that with Flask from Python. And this one will become a parameter that would be called via API or web form. And first, let's just install Flask. As usual on this channel, I copy and paste the code from my notes to avoid live typing. So we import Flask framework and serve the app like this. For now, without API, just as a proof of concept that the Flask does work. And to execute our homepage, we need to run flask run main.py, or let's actually rename the file into the default of Flask, which is app.py. So app.py, and then we don't need to provide any parameters here, just flask run. And it is running, and if we click that link, we have welcome to the homepage. So the Flask does work. Now let's create the API endpoint. And this is our code. From Flask we also import request and JSONify for API, and instead of that homepage we have route for API calculate salary. And we define that route as JSONify, which means JSON input output, and we expect salary as a result formatted like this, and the result is predict salary method from our model, right? And the input is request JSON experience. So our API endpoint is expecting a parameter called experience. So now let's open Postman or any API client of your choice, and let's try to launch that. So we have this URL as a running server, and then we have /API, all of that URL, and this is a post request. So in the body of that request, we put the raw JSON like this. It is expecting JSON experience equals, for example, 4.5. And let's see if it works now. Behind the scenes, I've restarted actually Python Flask server. Content type was not application JSON. So we need to have content type header in Postman, application JSON. We send again, and now we have the result. See, we're successfully using our API, which has model behind the scenes, and now we can provide any parameters you want. You can calculate salary for 7 years, send, we have the number. 1.5 years, send, we have the number. So this is how someone else would be using your machine learning model without having Python on their machine, without knowing about its Python or any technology. All they need is the API endpoint and provide the parameters that you require. You would just write API documentation page. Now, if you want that to be a web page, I will quickly show an example. Again, we import something from Flask, which is render template, and on top of the API we have two routes. Get route for the form, and then post route for submitting that form with another function. And again, we format, we predict salary, we call that method. The difference is just request form and request JSON. And for rendering template, we load exactly that, and we have that form HTML as an HTML page without any fancy stuff. We just have salary visible as a variable if that exists, like this, and then form with action to that endpoint, to that post route. And we have ID experience and name of experience, which is posted there. Now if we rerun that Flask run again, and then load that specific URL in the browser, we have this form. Of course, I zoomed it in, so years of experience, we provide 3, for example, and we have our number here. Behind the scenes, I fixed one more thing. We needed to translate that request form into a float Otherwise, we got string and integer error from Python. But now we can specify 3.5, for example, and get the number successfully. So yeah, we've built API and web, but behind the scenes, it uses the method predictSalary, which is kind of Python API, the public version. And behind the scenes, it uses already pre-trained machine learning model. So this is one way of publishing your machine learning model for others to use. In upcoming videos, I'm also planning to show how to deploy that on some server, on remote server like DigitalOcean, for example, and publish it on the web. But for now, I hope you get the idea and hope you will be able to publish your machine learning models as APIs or web pages. Subscribe to the channel to get more videos about Python and machine learning daily, and see you guys in other videos.